Susan Poger out of Chappaqua, New York. I kind of blended some of their stuff to make a better PowerPoint. You'll find that I'm good at stealing PowerPoints because I'm a bit of a perfectionist when it comes to that. It just takes me too long to make them. So, and look at that great picture of Theodore Roosevelt. All right, so we had a shift in starting around the 1890s in the U.S. In our foreign policy. Basically went from isolationism to interventionalism, okay? And so basically in the 19th century, for most of it, we had neutrality. We didn't get pulled into many foreign wars at all. After the War of 1812, other than fighting the Mexican War in the 1840s, which that was, we could call that an imperialist war, but we were fighting for manifest destiny in that situation. Basically, we avoid conflicts with other nations whenever possible, particularly European nations during the 19th century. Okay, during the 20th century, we adopt an intervention policy where we do engage other nations, and we're trying to promote the national interests of the United States. So we engage with nations to try and gain territory, to gain resources. Sometimes it's to gain allies. There's various reasons why we might do that. Okay. But there's two different ways we did this. Now, our old policy was actually it was a possible of an interventionist, but we followed something called the Monroe Doctrine that was issued in 1823 that basically said no more colonies, Europe. And overall, Europe basically stayed with that. They maintained what they controlled, and really the only two nations that really controlled much of anything of note were Spain and Britain after the 1823. The French had a tiny little piece of South America and like 2 islands in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. That was it. But so essentially they were busy with other parts of the world in their empire, and so we didn't really have a lot of struggle with them. Okay, but in the 20th century we're going to have intervention. Okay, and intervention, that's just when we engage. Okay. And interventionism versus sort of this isolationism, we're going to look at that throughout American history as far as our foreign policy. So right now, today in the 21st century, which are we doing, neutrality or intervention? Intervention. We intervene in situations, don't we? Maybe not as directly as we did earlier on, but we still do intervene. So, any questions about this? Okay, yes, Brandon.
Okay, so this neutral. Okay, so are you saying that intervention started in the middle of the 1800s?
No, it was more towards 1890 when we're actually truly intervening.
Okay, so it's not part of like the Gilded Age,
No. The ages kind of overlap because the Gilded Age usually people say goes to 1900. But in the 1890s, we started interventionism. Yes?
So, was interventionism, something that, they really had to persuade people to do? Because don't you see, a lot of speeches where they're trying to,
Somewhat, yes. And we'll get to that. You had the imperialists that were pro-imperialism, and you had the anti-imperialists, and you had a whole league of anti-imperialists that formed. And we'll talk about them, okay? So, all right, good? All right, so just kind of the essential question we're going to look at is why did we join? You don't have to write it down, but why did we become imperialists during this time? And there's 5 reasons. So our note's going to be 5 reasons that the U.S. started to engage in imperialism. 5 reasons we started to engage in imperialism. All right, so 5 reasons. Okay, ready? Number 1, commercial and business interests. Okay, commercial and business interests. Why would businesses want to gain more territory?
And make more money.
How are they going to make more money?
Make more plants.
They have a bigger,
Okay, customer base, bigger market, expanding markets. That's one reason. Okay, commercial and business interests, and under that put a little A. Okay, expanding markets. We can only sell our stuff to so many people, right? Particularly back then, we're talking sort of what we would call basic stuff, like shovels and things like that people are making. Well, what happens when everybody's got a shovel?
No one's there anymore.
Okay, a shovel's something that's going to wear out usually.
Not for a while.
It shouldn't for a while. I mean, are you going to make a substandard shovel that breaks out easily? No, because you're not going to be selling it. So basically, we had to expand markets to sell things like shovels and farm implements. So steel plows, one of the reasons they were so popular is because they lasted a long time, right? And so they had to expand those markets to sell to more people, okay? Also, somebody out there said something about resources, okay? Basically, expanding our market share makes us need more resources, but also imperialism expands our resources, okay? So that allows more raw materials for our factories. So that's, put a little B down there, that's raw materials for our factories, okay? In this chart here, I know you noticed on the test that there's going to be some charts and graphs and that kind of thing that you have to interpret. It's one of the history skills that the state is looking for you to have coming out of this class. It just shows that foreign investment increases a great deal. 1869, it was only $100 million. By 1908, it's $2.5 billion that we're doing. So there's a lot of increased foreign investment. So we see that expanding market share. Companies, like Ford Motor Company, I think I talked about that earlier when we talked about vertical integration. Ford started buying up rubber plantations around the world so that he had his own supply of rubber for the tires for cars and things like that. So we start to see these companies start to expand and they become multinationals. Okay, here's just another example, foreign trade going up, and here we see a global economy developing, all that joy. Okay, so second is military and strategic interests. Okay, military and strategic interests. Okay, basically we're going to fight a war in the 1890s that shows us we have a massive weakness. But military interests, basically, we have this huge country, and now that we do have 2 whole coastlines, that's pretty awesome, right? How long does it take to get from one coast to the other in 1890
Couple of days.
on a ship?
Oh, a few months.
You're looking at about 4 months. 4 months. What if we get attacked over here and our fleet's over here?
Oh, you.
Well,
That's tough.
we better hold out,
No more America.
I think we could probably, assemble a ship to go fight before we could get one over there, okay? So that is a strategic problem, isn't it? And we'll see part of imperialism will be working to build a canal, okay? Now, under military and strategic interests, one of the big proponents, now what's proponent mean?
Bad factors.
Proponent, that means somebody who is in favor of and pushing for something to be done, as opposed to an opponent. That's somebody challenging it, right? Okay. Well, one of the very key people involved in proposing to imperialism for military interests is this guy. His name is Alfred Thayer Mahon. Alfred Mahon. Okay, he wrote a history book. Just knowing that makes me love him, right? Okay. He wrote a book called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, 1660 to 1783. It's actually a history of the British Navy. Why? Why is that important for us?
It was the strongest navy the world had ever seen.
Okay, that was the zenith of the British Navy, was in this time period. Does anybody know what happened here?
The American Revolution.
That's the Constitution or something.
Well, not the Constitution. That is the end of the American Revolution. Okay?
Oh.
Not to say that the British Navy was no longer the most powerful Navy, but its zenith had passed. The British had been bested by somebody, although it was a limited war. The American Revolution was like the British's Vietnam. Public opinion stopped that war. But now they were diminished in the world view because those rebellious Yankees had gotten their freedom. Okay? Mahon takes what the British did and he says the U.S. needs to follow that model. Okay? essentially the British established bases all around the world. Why would they establish naval bases all around the world?
Second on my.
What do you think, Drew?
To be ready if anything goes down.
They have a force there, but also they have a place to resupply their navy, right? Also, the British maintained the shipping lanes during that time period. They patrolled them to keep piracy down. Now, we've all probably seen Pirates of the Caribbean. Who was Jack Sparrow always running from?
Calco. Oh, never mind.
He was always running from the British Navy, right? Okay. They were maintaining the shipping lanes, keeping peace on the sea. And they had to do this. They had to maintain their navy. Also, the British always kept the most modern navy that they could. All right? And the British, even though we could go a little further, the British were also instrumental in building a canal. Does anybody know where the British built a canal?
In
Channel?
Egypt, right?
Hmm?
Like in like the Egypt, like over there.
Yeah, it's called the Suez Canal, right? The Suez Canal.
How do you spell that?
Suez, okay? The British built the Suez Canal, which connected the Red Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, right? Which cut off sailing around a giant continent. What continent did that cut off sailing around? Africa. I mean, it's literally almost the same thing
The Red
as the
Sea.
U.S. has to deal with, except Africa's way bigger than South America, because Africa is actually the second largest continent in the world. Okay? So, you see how he took something from history and said we could learn from it.
Nice.
Oh my heavens, right? Okay. Now, he actually was a naval admiral, so good stuff. So, the big things that he said in his book. One, we need to build a modern navy. What does a modern navy mean in the 1890s?
Ships.
Steamhold ships.
Steel-hulled ships, which we already had mostly done. But also we need to have the strongest weapons, the best armor, all that kind of stuff. Fastest engines. We're going to actually develop some new types of ships during this time because of Mahon. Okay, he also said we needed to establish bases, particularly in the Caribbean and in the Pacific. Why do we, and like I said, it's a history book, but he applies what the U.S. needs to do in his book. Okay, so why do we need bases in the Caribbean and bases in the Pacific?
For like the well don't they own doesn't like the British and colonies own stuff in the Caribbean, right?
There are some there's Spanish and British territory in the Caribbean, yes, and actually Dutch territory at that point too. So yes, there are those, but essentially it's for shore defense for us, and also is to protect trade interests in that area. If you think back to Pirates of the Caribbean, wait a minute, where are those pirates?
In the Caribbean.
The Caribbean.
In the Caribbean. All right. So anyway, it was to control trade with those areas too. Also, it was to protect his next point, which was he said we needed to build a canal, much like the British had done. Okay? We needed to build an Ishmaelian canal.
Come again?
Okay? Basically, this is an isthmus, a narrow strip of land that connects two larger bodies of land. Okay? And that's called the Isthmus of Panama. Actually, the Isthmus of Panama starts sort of here south of the Yucatan Peninsula and goes all the way down here to Colombia. All right? The whole thing is the Isthmus of Panama, not just the country of Panama. Okay? He said somewhere in there we need to build a canal. And actually, he probably recommended Nicaragua, which they had already tried to do that before. Okay? So, Alfred Mahon, modern Navy, new bases in the Caribbean and the Pacific. And he said to do that, we might have to gain some territory and also build that not Panama Canal, an Ishmaelian Canal. Okay? Imagine if it was the Nicaragua Canal. Doesn't have the same ring to it, does it? All right. So anyway, any questions about Mahon?
Wait,
Wait, what did you
Wait.
said the modern navy, the canal, and then what was the other thing that you said?
Build an Ishmaelian. Modern Navy bases in the Caribbean and Pacific. Okay. And the other thing, he did also argue that we should always protect the shipping lanes. Okay, like patrol them and protect them. Yes, sir.
What's the difference between the Panama Canal and the Ishmaeli Canal?
It's the same thing. The Panama Canal is called the Panama Canal because we built it in Panama.
Then why are are you saying Ishmaeli? Is it like a different place?
No, it's the Isthmus of Panama.
Oh, it's the same thing?
Yeah,
Okay.
it's just not calling it Panama because, well, Panama wasn't even a country at this point.
Okay.
It was part of Colombia. Yes.
Isn't this sort of tied into economic interests?
Yes. It is tied to economic interests, but not so much business interests. This, because Mahon's looking at it from a purely military standpoint, this will make us stronger because all of his is tied back to defense of our nation. Okay? And actually, we fight one of our worst fought wars in the 1890s, and that sort of kicks us in the butt, and we really do everything he says. All right? Third thing is social Darwinism. What? Social Darwinism? Survival of the fittest, right? Applied to business and culture and all that kind of stuff. All right? A lot of people, they believed in hierarchy of race. And as we get into the progressives, there's some weird eugenics ideas that were going around that essentially we could breed poverty out of society. Weird stuff. But just know that it's sort of that, and I say the British model is that we're better than everybody else. That's the idea that people had. And some people argued that we needed imperialism because we need to civilize the savages and things like that. And there you've got the sort of the hierarchy of race. That was something that was published. And this also brings in the concept of the white man's burden. White Man's Burden, which is actually a Rudyard Kipling poem. It's sort of that British idea, but we embrace it. The white man's burden, essentially, according to Kipling, in his poem, The White Man's Burden, is that it is the Europeans' job to raise up the inferior groups of people. And you notice that what Uncle Sam, actually that's Theodore Roosevelt, he is carrying that's actually a Filipino right there, up to the schoolhouse so we can educate them.
It was the European jobs ready to raise the what?
To raise up what they considered the inferior groups of people through education and make them less savage. The funny thing dealing with the Philippines is the Philippines had been a colony of a European nation for 300 years. They spoke Spanish for the most part. Most of them were Roman Catholic. And yeah, so the whole savagery thing didn't quite work. In fact, our president, when we gained the Philippines, had to be shown where it was in the world.
Okay, so what is it? Because I was kind of like just.
Where are the Philippines? Okay.
It's by Indonesia, right?
It's in between.
Okay, there are a couple of archipelagos that you need to know on your map, right? The Philippines are just north of Indonesia.
Got it.
There's about 15 to 1,700 sort of islands that make up the Philippines. Okay.
I thought we owned those islands.
Not anymore, but we did for a while.
Oh.
All right, had a little buyer's remorse on that. Okay. All right, does everybody understand the concept of white man's burden? Now, I want you to understand this is a British idea that, and truly that term comes from Rudyard Kipling's poem, The White Man's Burden, okay, which actually a little bit later in the slideshow you'll see an excerpt of it. Okay, but it's the idea that we're raising up those inferior. Now, I want you to understand, I'm using the terms they use. I in no way think that these people are inferior, okay? But a lot of times, and it's kind of human nature, the things that you don't understand, like the other languages, the other religions, and that kind of thing, you fear and you have a tendency to put it beneath what you believe, that kind of thing. But that's sort of that British idea, okay? But the white man's burden, and you're going to see, I'll go ahead and give you a warning, in this PowerPoint presentation, there's a lot of not politically correct images from this time period. Okay, completely not politically correct. So I'll go ahead and get that out of the way. All right, so the fourth thing was religious and missionary interests, okay? Actually, that's where the first Americans came to Hawaii, was these congregational missionaries from New England. The idea, and truly most religions, most major religions at least, have some sort of a spread the word about that
Second
religion.
lunch, Blue Dine-In, may head to the cafeteria. Second lunch, Blue Dine-In.
Particularly Christianity, particularly Islam, there's sort of this go out and get converts, that kind of thing. And so particularly China was one of the big missionary fields for Christian missionaries from all over the world during this time period, okay? But that was another reason, was to spread the religion. And the predominant religion spread from the U.S. was some denomination of Christianity.
Protestantism?
Yes.
So is this kind of like, was it the three G's, whenever they went to go, like colonial imperialism, like God, glory, and gold, kind of?
Because the government was not necessarily engaged in the religious part, but people supported imperialism because it opened up a mission field for them, that kind of thing. When you're talking about sort of the Spanish model, right, which that was a key part, particularly under Ferdinand and Isabella, is spread Roman Catholicism. And that's because they felt they owed a whole lot to Roman Catholicism, because that was where one of the successful places for the Crusades was. They drove the Moors out of the Iberian Peninsula. This is it's more of a subset. I want you to understand the government was not necessarily sending the missionaries, but the government was gaining territory, and people supported this because now China was going to be open to the missions. The Philippines, even though the Philippines were already Roman Catholic, there was work to be done there, that kind of thing. Okay, Faith
Was the time going to be important to this unit?
is like the era, the years.
Like the time, like the years.
Yes. Brandon.
This is going too far deep, but I have a
Probably.
question. Like, they didn't have Google Translate back then, right?
Correct.
So how did they talk
They'd get a translator?
to them?
They would have to hire people, and truly, even missionaries today, like our pastor was a missionary to China before China kicked everybody out, and they spent 2 years learning the language before they could even go do the missionary stuff. Even today, even when we have Google Translate, of course, I don't think Google works in China. So
they would have had to hire like Chinese immigrants.
Yeah, Chinese immigrants, or hire someone there that knew the language. I mean, it was a difficult situation. Even doing business in that area, you had to rely on translators. And you have to put a measure of faith in the people you hire to be translators too, don't you? Because you don't know what they're saying. And at least until you learn the language. All right, so this is another, you see the porters carrying the lady missionaries here, and this is a direct, so you see Uncle Sam there. Now, who was the guy who gave us Uncle Sam? What Thomas Nast did, right? Okay. So this is Uncle Sam, and here we have that's the British, and back here I don't know, he's a little pixelated. That's the Germans. Okay, and back here you got the French. Okay, and that's basically those are the influencers in China during this time period. All right. The fifth thing was the closing of the American frontier. We ran out of space, man. Now, what does that mean? Did we really run out of space? No. Any of you who've driven across the country realize there's a whole lot of wide open space, right? And particularly if you drive across Kansas or Colorado or somewhere like that, there's a whole lot of open space that's not even like cultivated, okay? There is nothing there. Any place where the sun goes down and you don't see a single street light when you're on the plains and you can see for 25 miles, you realize we're not out of land, okay? But the closing of the frontier, basically a historian freaked everybody out. What's that historian's name? Does anybody know? Frederick Jackson Turner. Okay? Frederick Jackson Turner in 1890 wrote something called the Frontier Thesis. The Frontier Thesis. Frederick Jackson Turner wrote the Frontier Thesis. Okay? In his Frontier Thesis, he outlined something that he called the safety valve theory. Frederick Jackson Turner, Frontier Thesis, 1890. He outlined the safety valve theory.
basically, he was a historian. Again, a tie to history where people are trying to learn from other stuff that had happened in the past. It's amazing, right? Okay, so he said, look at Europe. Europe, I mean, if you've studied European history, it's nothing but wars. It's literally nothing but wars. Imperialism had started eons ago. I mean, go back to Rome. It's all wars, right? And then once the wars stop, then it all falls apart, right? Okay, so Turner argued that particularly in modern European history, you had so many wars, even civil wars, that they were all fought over land, okay? And the lack of availability of land. So the closing of our frontier, he said that basically in 1890, the Census Bureau declared the frontier closed, that every place was settled. And in 1890, the Homestead Act was done at that point, at least in the lower 48 states. There'll be another Homestead Act in Alaska that was still in play up until the 1980s. Dang it, I missed out on that free land. But the thing is, once they said the frontier was closed, people started reading this frontier thesis, which came out in the 1890s, like I said. And it freaked them out because what Turner had said was that our free land in America acted as a safety valve. If Nick there got tired of living in New York City or there was some conflict in New York City, what could he do?
Move somewhere.
He could just claim some free land and start over somewhere else, right? And that way those conflicts, it wouldn't build up. He could go get his own piece of land and everything would be good. Well, now that there's no more free land, people get freaked out about that. Because if there's no more free land, now we're going to have all these conflicts and stuff like that. And actually later on, people say the frontier thesis was sort of disproven. But now, even today, people are kind of looking at some of our urban areas where there's a lot of conflict in the cities and things like that. And they say, well, maybe there was something to it. The people who are upset in the urban areas are the people who do not have the ability to do what? Move to a new place, to start over. So it's kind of an interesting thought. I don't know. Somebody had their hand up. Nick did, and then I'll get you, Andrew. Nick, what you got?
Frederick Jackson Turner wrote the Frontier Thesis.
Mm-hmm.
It scared people.
Yeah, make sure you got safety valve theory.
It was back. It was sick.
Okay, the safety valve theory is basically the free land. If you got unhappy, you could go somewhere else, and then that does away with the angst that you had, because now if you're in a situation that you don't like, that you can't control, that you could just move somewhere else and start over, right? He says without that free land, he actually said that the free land that the U.S. had, that made us different from Europe. That's why historically we weren't embroiled in all these wars, because you got to understand, overall, we had a very peaceful 19th century war-wise. We did fight the War of 1812, which we didn't gain anything out of it. Okay, we did fight the Mexican War. That wasn't your normal kind of war either. And the Civil War, and the argument there, he said, again, had to do with the landless people and that kind of thing. But he said that a good thing that came out of the Civil War was that Homestead Act that gave free land. Okay? And he said then we have a good long period of no wars. But during that time, I mean, the Crimean War went on. The Europeans were fighting. I mean, we had all these other wars. The Opium Wars had been fought during that time period that the U.S. wasn't involved in. And he says the free land is what made us different. So that's what the safety valve theory is. Okay? And he's important to that, and historians still refer back to it. And to me, it's interesting that they're still talking about it today, 130 years later. Yes, sir?
So why is it called a valve?
A safety valve is something that lets pressure off, okay? Like your water heater at home has a safety valve on it. It's on the side of it. There's a little thing you can pull and test it. But basically, if so much pressure builds up, that valve automatically opens. That's why if you go home and there's water pouring out of a pipe on the side of your house, chances are your safety valve on your water heater has been tripped, which means the thermostat's gone out and it's keeping your water heater from becoming a bomb, basically. Because truly, if that safety valve on that water heater clogs up and doesn't set off and your thermostat's off, it's just boiling up and building a big head of steam pressure, and what eventually is going to happen. that tank's going to fail. And literally it can shoot straight through the roof of your house. It can blow up your whole house. Okay? And it's like a $2 valve that's protecting your house. Scary, right? You trust Kenmore and GE, the people who made that? Hope so. All right. All right. Okay. So now we've got those main reasons for American imperialism. Everybody feel warm and fuzzy about it? I sure do. Okay. Now you want to make sure you know those. Okay. Multiple choice question. I'm not going to make you list that on a test. Although, we're going to have a quiz next week. It could come up as a listing question on that. Just to make sure you know it. Okay. So the basis of our foreign policy during the 19th century was the Monroe Doctrine. Yay, James Monroe. Good for him. Do you know he's the president who came the closest to matching George Washington's electoral college vote? Did you know that? George Washington is the only president in American history to have a unanimous electoral college vote. He would have had an electoral college vote, except one elector said, wait, he can't be like George Washington, and he voted for another guy.
Was that the reason?
He did that on purpose?
He did that on purpose, yeah.
What did he say?
James Monroe's presidency is known as the era of good feelings. Okay, we were at a relative peace. This is after the War of 1812 was over. But also there's a lot of crazy stuff going on in the world, particularly the New World during his presidency. New Spain collapses during James Monroe's presidency. And out of New Spain grow all these brand new democracies. Very weak countries like Mexico, all of the Central American countries that get their independence, all the South American countries that get their independence, with the exception of Brazil. Okay? Because Brazil, at that point, was still a colony of what country? Portugal. Yay! All right, somebody paid attention in geography class.
What fell again?
Okay, New Spain. New Spain collapses. Okay, Simon Bolivar. The whole thing falls apart. Okay, he was the revolutionary who got Mexico its independence. That's why there is a Bolivar County in Mississippi. Did you know that?
Yeah.
Yeah, Bolivar. It's Bolivar County because we're in the South. We don't say stuff right. But Simon Bolivar, he was the revolutionary that got Mexico its independence, and that was in the 1820s. And Mississippi became a state in 1817. We started naming counties. So we got a Monroe County named after that guy. And we have Bolivar County, or Bolivar County, named after Simon Bolivar. All right, so moving on. So basically the Monroe Doctrine, what this was, those weak new democracies, they were threatened by European powers. Basically, we were afraid that, yes, New Spain was collapsed. We were afraid the British or the French or the Germans or somebody would come in and say, oh, look, a garage sale, and pick up some new territories. Okay? So we set out a warning. It's called the Monroe Doctrine. We basically said, hey, the era of European colonization in the New World is over. No new colonies. Okay? And that's 1823. This really doesn't get directly tested by European nations. There's a couple little things, but overall it's not tested much by these European powers. Yes, sir. 23. And this becomes the basis of our foreign policy all through the 19th century. Okay? No new colonies. And overall, it's recognized. In 1823, we had no power. We had no ability to stop the British Navy from coming in and saying, hey, this is a cool piece of land. I think we'll take it. But Britain really didn't have a reason to. Canada was a colony of Britain at this point. They still had Guyana. They had Jamaica, the Bahamas. All these areas were still British possessions. So the British, they kind of were okay. France, they were going to cause a little dust up here and there, but not too bad. All right? So any questions about the Monroe Doctrine? That was the basis of ours. This is just showing sort of the growth of our country. We talked about that already. That's America then. And I think, we didn't look at this, but that's Manifest Destiny. This is called American Progress. It's a great painting. Very, very yay America situation. Because the Native Americans were no longer in play. You see, light is following Lady Liberty, who is marching across the continent. This is Manifest Destiny in picture form. And you see progress is following. Look at the choo-choo trains. Okay? And look at bridges and all this sort of stuff. And you got farmers, and the natives are running away because the settlers are coming. Also the buffalo, they're gone too. They're running away. And look, she's bringing light to the darkness.
There's some teepee in the background.
Yes, they're about to be gone. Okay, all right. So it's a great great piece of art there. It's called American Progress. All right, that's imperialism. That just shows the British Empire, where they said the sun never sets on the British Empire. Yeah, it's true. It is true. All right, that's 1921. Okay, you see they still got some little stuff there. It's good stuff. All right, and so we get the idea. Yeah, we can do that, and so we do. All right.
Whoa!
All right, so that's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. That's a defense pact. That's just showing, yeah, these are all allies. Yay. Good stuff. All right, so how do we go from an isolated nation to a world power? And we're going to look at that.